Welcome to the Walled Garden Podcast, the flagship podcast of the Walled Garden Philosophical Society, a global community of philosophers and students sharing the philosophical path together. If you'd like to learn more, just go to thewalledgarden.com. We welcome your participation in our community. But for now, we hope that this episode serves you well. Hello friends, and welcome to another episode of the Walled Garden Podcast. My name's Simon Drew, and man, it is good to be back. I'm so excited for the next few months where we'll be releasing just so many phenomenal conversations and talks that we've had in the Walled Garden Philosophical Society. And you know, we have so much to be grateful for when it comes to the incredible, brilliant minds, the beautiful people who we get access to through this podcast and through the organization. People who come along and share their wisdom, you know, their life-learned lessons so that we can learn from them and become stronger, wiser, better every single day. It's a beautiful thing. And we're actually going to be hearing today from one of our contributing philosophers in the Walled Garden Philosophical Society, none other than Judith Stove. And if you've never listened to Judith's previous episodes on this podcast, you haven't come across her work yet, please do yourself a favor, go to thewalledgarden.com, head to the Groves page. You can find her grove on the Walled Garden. It's called Roots of the Garden. And Judith is writing these wonderful pieces where she's exploring the philosophical tradition of Western culture, starting from Plato up. And she's doing some excellent work there. If you're interested in that topic, if you're interested in going back to the classical wisdom that really underlies our entire culture, you've got to check out her work. She's doing phenomenal work over there, and she's just a beautiful person. There are so many reasons to love Judith. When I first started getting to know her, it was very clear to me that she was a classicist, right? Maybe not technically, maybe not with all the degrees, but you know, here's a woman who has spent so much of her life really trying to master classical languages like Latin and Greek so that she can go deeper and deeper into these ancient texts and really understand the context, but not only the language, the history. You know, if you come along to these meetups that we're running called Soul Searching with Seneca, we do them every couple of weeks. You can see the events on the Walled Garden website. When you come to these events, you'll get to know Judith, and you'll also get to know just the depth of wisdom and understanding she has around the classical world. You know, you ask the most random question about a particular word or a particular detail in Seneca's writings, and she's just got this wealth of information to dump on us all, you know, about the historical, the political context, you know, what life was like at the time, you know, who the people were, who was important, you know, there's so much there. So just do yourself a favor, check out her work, check out her episodes on this podcast. Come along to the events that she's running, including, look, if you're listening to this episode on the day that it's released, well, tomorrow, Thursday, the 2nd of November, we're actually having an event with Judith, along with Dr. Matthew Sharp and Dr. William O. Stevens, right? And we're going to be talking about Stoicism and emotions. So this is going to be a very interesting topic. I know a lot of you are interested in the philosophy of Stoicism, as am I. And it's going to be a phenomenal conversation between three brilliant minds. So go ahead and go to thewalledgarden.com/events. You can register for that. But I know that many of you will not be listening to this the day of. So anyway, I just want to give you a little bit of information about what you're about to hear. So this was an event that Judith hosted a couple of weeks ago. It's called Losing Our Memories, Stoicism and the Suppression of Truth. And the event came about because Judith was recently posting on social media about new legislation in Australia that would give the government more power to censor certain types of information, or to decide what is information and what is misinformation, for example. And so I said to Judith, hey, listen, why don't we talk about this? Why don't you do an event? And she gladly accepted, and the way that we frame this event is she actually wanted to give us some historical and philosophical context to show us that, hey, even the ancient Stoics dealt with things like this. Seneca dealt with things like this. We've seen all of this before. Human nature does not change, right? There is a continuation throughout time of these cycles. And so I'm excited for you to listen to this episode. Judith has done a fantastic job, as she always does with her presentations. Rich in information, rich in things to think about, questions to consider, and we love her for it. So thank you, Judith. And if you haven't seen Judith's work before, go check it out. You will not be disappointed. So without further ado, here is Judith Stove, Losing Our Memories, Stoicism and the Suppression of Truth.
Today's topic is called Losing Our Memories, Stoicism and the Suppression of Truth. And as Simon just alluded to, it's come about because of some new legislation that the government wants to bring in here in Australia. And it's called the Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill 2023. And this bill has been in the drafting stage and the public comment stage for some time now. And what it attempts to do, or will attempt to do, is to control material shared on internet platforms. And as the drafters have said, it's a deliberately broad legislation. It aims to control material that is judged, quote, likely to cause serious harm, unquote, if shared online. So I went and had a look at the draft legislation to see what are some examples of serious harm in the view of the drafters. So here's some examples in the draft legislation summary. And I'm sorry, the print's pretty small. So I know it's quite hard to read. But here are some examples of the types of harms that they're thinking about and an example of it. The first one is hatred against a group in Australian society on the basis of ethnicity, nationality, race, or gender. And so an example of harm on that score would be misinformation about a group of Australians inciting others to commit hate crimes against that group. That seems pretty straightforward. But then further down, we have something interesting, which is a type of harm to the health of Australians. And then the example of serious harm there is misinformation that caused people to ingest or inject bleach products to treat a viral infection. That sounds familiar. Where have we heard that before? So I think that's probably quite a politically motivated example. And it's curious too that a referendum is mentioned in the examples when, as it happens, for the very first time in this 21st century, as I drafted this, Australia was preparing for a major referendum, which has now just come and gone, on the proposed Indigenous voice to Parliament. But more importantly, either the government, through its regulating body, that's called ACMA, or the digital platforms themselves, or their delegates, the fact-checking bodies, would decide what's likely to cause serious harm. So what is the problem that the legislation is purporting to solve? Why is it supposed to be necessary? Social media has given ordinary people unprecedented power to communicate with each other. And that means the widespread sharing of information, including that which the government doesn't want people to read. Now, a friend pointed out to me that there are legitimate concerns, perhaps around material that can be generated by AI, by bots and so on. And certainly we've seen cases of that kind of thing. But I think most people can distinguish between bot-generated information and human-generated information most of the time. And so I would suggest that's probably a straw man. But first of all, before we look at the Stoic side of things, well, I think we need to have a bit of a think about what kinds of records we have about what's happened in the past. We've got two, so there's current speech and communication, that's one thing. But there's also records of the past, and there are two main kinds. There are naturally occurring records, and here we see a fossil of a plant, a ginkgo, which is still a genus that we see today. And there are human-made records, but made before writing. So we call them prehistoric, and the cave paintings in Europe are an example of that, or here in Australia as well. Then we have historic records, the ones that were generated in the age of writing. And these come into different kinds as well. There are official records, and here's one here. This is a record about some silver from the Middle East in around 2,500 BCE. It's in the British Museum. So there are also personal records, and they include letters, literary works, artworks. And then there is history. These are accounts purporting to indicate a sequence of events, causes and effects, actions and decisions by people. Now, when we consider past records, we should recognise that censorship has always been around. And the word censor itself comes directly from the Latin. It is a Latin word. Censor is Latin. In the Roman Republic, it was a role of officials who had certain responsibilities, and these included maintaining the census, the register of citizens and their property, which of course is always very important to governments because it allows them to assess how much tax those people can pay. They had some other finance functions, but they also had a role in maintaining public morality. And the office of the censor was current for over 400 years until the very end of the Roman Republic. Now, what things did they act on when it came to public morality? These tended to be things that were not actually illegal. They weren't crimes, but they were considered undesirable kind of behaviours. One of the things that tended to get suppressed regularly were foreign cults, foreign religious groups, but also things like magic and astrology. Trying to read the future in the stars, that was considered a no-no, and it was subject to censorship. And so, but also the things that changed tended to, the things that were censored tended to change over time. And by the time we got to the imperial period, late in the 1st century BCE, there was a broadening of what was considered censor-worthy. Now, and the idea was not to actually commit all these records to oblivion, because that was too difficult, but it was to deter people. It was a discouragement of people circulating material. So what were kinds of censorship that took place? I'll get to the Damnatio Memoriae in a minute, but there was book burning of forbidden texts. There was influence placed on authors. There could be a sentence of exile or even death for a work, a speech, or for practices. But in order to carry out that kind of censorship, there had to be some kind of accusation from an emperor, a senator, or a fellow writer. And a senatus consultum, that's a decision of the Senate, had to be made to condemn an individual. In extreme cases, we have what was called damnatio memoriae, and that's what we had. This is a case from much later in the 3rd century of the Christian era. You can see this is a portrait of the Emperor Septimius Severus, his wife Julia Domna. And originally there were 2 children's faces showing there, but you can see that one of them has been literally erased. And that's because the child on the right, when he was a young adult, Caracalla, had his brother Geta murdered and had his name and images scrubbed from all the public records. So that's what damnatio memoriae was. It was a very extreme form of personal censorship. But as well as public speeches and public utterances, the Roman state realised that records and memories could also be dangerous. And so Augustus, the very first Roman emperor, shifted in his focus from destroying the magic, the astrological texts, to suppressing political writings, which he didn't like and which he considered defamatory. And so the historian Tacitus describes this change. He says, previously deeds were denounced, actions were denounced, but words went unpunished. Facta agoebantur, dicta impune erant, he says. But now books themselves could be destroyed as a punishment. So here I've got a bit of a timeline, and don't worry if it's a bit hard to read. But I suppose my point in making up the timeline was pretty much just to show that over this period of the early emperors, there was a great deal of censorship of writers and thinkers. And if we look at, under Tiberius there, the period 14 to 37 of the Christian era, we find that there was this guy called Sejanus, and he was Tiberius's right-hand man. Now, Tiberius himself wasn't that interested in governing, and so he tended to hand over a lot of functions of government to Sejanus, who was a real persecutor and who just got rid of people and books and everything that he didn't like. And he punished a historian called Aulus Cremutius Cordus. So we'll come back to those later ones that I've got on the under Nero, Vespasian, and so on. But let's go to Cremutius Cordus. So at this time, as I say, real or perceived attacks on the emperor started to be censored. And Cremutius Cordus was a historian. He was a writer of history. And he praised in his history the Republican heroes Brutus and Cassius. We don't have much of his work surviving today, but the fragments that we do have cover the Roman Civil War and the reign of Augustus. And because Cordus praised these Republican heroes, the Senate ordered that his writings be burnt. Now, the historian Tacitus writes about this whole episode around Cremutius Cordus, and he quotes Cordus as saying to the Senate, defending himself to the Senate. And this is what Cordus said. Surely I'm not making speeches to incite the people to civil war, as though Brutus and Cassius were armed on the fields of Philippi. Or is it not the case that they, despite being dead for 70 years, exercise through literature a hold over a part of our memory, in the same way that they are known to us through their statues, which not even the victor abolished? Future generations give everyone their due honour, nor will there be lacking, even if I am condemned, people who will remember Cassius, Brutus, and even myself. Tacitus tells us, then Cordus walked out of the Senate and starved himself to death. The Senate decreed that the aediles, that's one of the public officials, should burn his books. But they survived, hidden, and then republished. For this reason, one is more inclined to laugh at the foolishness of those who imagine that today's regime can extinguish the subsequent generation's memory. So that's what the writer Tacitus had to say about this episode. Now, we also know about Cordus from the writings of Seneca, one of our favourite Stoics. And we know this because Cordus's daughter Marcia was a friend of Seneca's. And he wrote to her the Consolation of Marcia. Marcia kept texts of her father's books, and this was a crime. She could have been executed or exiled for doing that. But then she later became actively involved in their republication in the following reign, under the reign of Caligula. So this is what Seneca said to his friend Marcia. You did all that lay in your power to avert the death of your father, Aulus Cremutius Cordus. When the changes of our times gave you an opportunity, you restored to the use of man that genius of your father for which he had suffered, and made him in real truth immortal by publishing as an eternal memorial of him those books which that bravest of men had written with his own blood. You have done a great service to Roman literature. A large part of Cordus's books had been burnt. A great service to posterity, which will receive a true account of events, which cost its author so dear, and a great service to himself, whose memory flourishes and ever will flourish, as long as men set any value upon the facts of Roman history. And so Seneca goes on, as long as anyone lives who wishes to review the deeds of our time and know what a true Roman was like, one who still remained uncorrupted when all other necks were broken in to receive the yoke of Sejanus. By Hercules, we would have sustained a great loss if you had not brought him forth from oblivion, to which his two splendid qualities, eloquence and independence, had consigned him. He is now read, is popular, is received into men's hearts and bosoms, and fears no old age. But as for those who butchered him, before long men will cease to speak even of their crimes, the only things for which they are remembered. So here we see Seneca drawing a contrast between Cordus, who died as a virtuous man trying to tell the truth, and the people who prosecuted them, who are just going to be forgotten because their works are the only thing that their crimes are the only thing that distinguish them. So this is why, from a Stoic point of view, we need history. Human memory is very fallible, even more fallible than we realise, even about our own lives, let alone anything else. Can you remember what you were doing a year ago today or 2 years ago? Even our own lives, we're not very good at recalling. And if records are not kept, information is just lost. And history is a special kind of information. A historian writes what he or she thinks happened and what the sources were for the information. As Seneca always reminds us, we're closer to the end of life than we think. So we need things to be written down, and we need them, once written down, to be preserved. And that's the role of libraries and of databases. And I would say that in our era, where everything is digitized, it's very vulnerable in that sense to being changed and to being lost. So as time went on, we saw Cordus's historical works were suppressed under Tiberius, but they were republished under Caligula. Now, Caligula was not a good emperor, but he was a bit more liberal in terms of information than Tiberius. Caligula was assassinated, and he was succeeded by his uncle Claudius, and that's who is in the picture on the right. Now, Claudius was actually the subject of one of Seneca's very satirical works called the Apocalyptosis, which is the pumpkinification, which makes fun of Claudius's claims to be deified at his death, turned into a god. Claudius, in his turn, was succeeded by his nephew Nero. And Nero was opposed by the Stoic senators, for instance, Thrasea And we know a lot about these Stoic opponents to Nero and Domitian because of the historian Tacitus. Tacitus tells us that a gentleman called Capito, who's I don't think is otherwise very well known, but he said, we really need to stamp out Stoicism altogether, because these people are wannabe Brutuses, he said, aemulus Brutorum. And he said, this Capito person said, well, either let's pass over their system, that means Stoicism, or let these seekers after a new world lose their freedom and their instigator. It's a cult, he said. Stoicism as a cult, which is really kind of interesting. That's how Stoicism's rivals regarded it at this time. And he said, this Capito said that Stoicism is a particularly dangerous cult because it talks about liberty and freedom, but intends to overthrow liberty and freedom. Now, these are kind of political sentiments that I think we can, again, recognize from our own time. In a political context, people are also always talking about the other side as being the threat to freedom and the threat to democracy in our sense. It's a political staple, and looking at history shows it was even in Roman times. Now, what was Thrasea Paetus's crime here? Well, he walked out of the Senate rather than face Nero there. He refused to give an oath of loyalty to Nero. He wasn't going to sacrifice to Nero's divine cult. He made it clear that he opposed what Nero was about and Nero's many crimes. But as we can see, Thrasea's moral opposition was reframed as a political exercise and attempt to overthrow the empire. And of course, once you frame somebody as trying to overthrow the empire, well, then obviously punishment is more readily justifiable. And as we see over and over again in Roman history, where there are these punishments on offer, there's always somebody with a grievance. It might be a personal one, it might be a financial one even. Some people who want to take advantage of that and prosecute that person ostensibly for their crimes against the state, but actually for a political grievance. And this happened to both Thrasea Paetus and to Boreas Araunus, both Stoics and both accused by rivals with a personal gripe. Thrasea was called a traitor and a public enemy, and his son-in-law, Helvidius Priscus, was another Stoic, and he was accused of insanity as well. Accusations of mental illness are also staples in such a political context. Unfortunately, in fact, though, it was another Stoic, Publius Ignatius, who accused Boreas Araunus. And Tacitus writes that this Ignatius fellow was all about showing off as a Stoic, but it was all show because he took advantage of these penalties to prosecute other Stoics. And even people who wrote about those men were also punished. People who wrote their biographies and histories were punished. And these historians were called Arulenus Rusticus and Herennius Seneca, and their books were burnt. And Rusticus, who was a respected official, was put to death because he wrote a panegyric, a verse of praise about Thrasea-Paetus. Herennius Seneca wrote in praise of Helvidius Priscus, so he too was put to death in the reign of Domitian in 93. And we learn about this again from Tacitus in another of his works. And this is what Tacitus said. Eulogies, indeed, were written by Arulenus Rusticus and Herennius Senecio, the one of Thrasea-Paetus, the other of Helvidius Priscus. But both were treated as capital offences. The savage rage of their enemies was vented upon the books as well as upon their authors. The public executioners, under official instructions, made a bonfire in the comitium and forum of those masterpieces of literary art. In those fires, doubtless the government imagined that it could silence the voice of Rome and annihilate the freedom of the Senate and men's knowledge of the truth. And this picture here is, of course, what remains today of the Roman Forum, and that's where these works were burnt. Rome of old explored the utmost limits of freedom. We have plumbed the depths of slavery, robbed as we are by informers, even of the right to exchange ideas and conversation. We would have lost our memories as well as our tongues had it been as easy to forget as to be silent. Tacitus was not a Stoic himself, but he was very pro-Stoic. He's what we call Stoic adjacent. And he was very concerned with the issues around justice and political freedom. And this quote about that he wrote about the burning of those books was from his biography of his father-in-law, Gnaeus Iulius Agricola, who was a general and who conquered Britain on behalf of Rome. And here we have a statue of Agricola at Bath in the UK. Agricola is regarded in the UK pretty positively, even though he represented the invader, because he seems to have been a decent man. So, and here's Hadrian's Wall, you know, a great symbol of Roman Britain. Agricola, and this is Tacitus' point, was a virtuous man in unvirtuous times. But also Tacitus, as a historian, could see the Roman conquest from the point of view of the people who were being conquered. And he puts this very famous remark in the mouth of one of the British leaders opposing the Romans. Now, this Calgacus may or may not have existed. That's a matter for scholars to debate. But this is an incredibly famous expression from Tacitus. The Romans make a desert and call it peace. Ubi solitudinem faciunt pacem appellant. So that's a wonderful expression which really exposes the Pax Romana, the great peace of the empire, from the point of view of the people whose homes were turned into a desert in order to accommodate the Pax Romana. It's a brilliant judgment on the Roman imperium. But that's what history is, you know. It's important to include different points of view, and that's why Tacitus is such a great historian. It's what history is. It's also what journalism and reporting are or should be. So, to bring us back to our own situation, obviously enough, execution, banishment, punishment of virtuous men and women is an injustice. And of course, justice is one of the key virtues for Stoics. The suppression of reporting and history is a form of injustice, though of course it is a lesser one. Free discussion about public issues, including government figures and government policies, is an important element of freedom in general. And when people self-censor, it's not a good thing. Let's just look at Tacitus's expression again. He said, we should have lost our memories as well as our tongues had it been as easy to forget as to be silent. His point is, if we are silent, if we self-censor, we're at risk of forgetting what has occurred, the injustices committed, but also virtuous acts of protest. And let's remind ourselves, who are the people who are going to be doing this censoring on social media, who already do it? They're the fact checkers. This was a couple of months ago where a fact checker was suspended over claims of trying to influence people about the recent referendum. Then there was the BBC fact checker who seems to have lied on her CV. And then there was a judgment in the US in September that the US government coerced and significantly encouraged the social media giants to remove or throttle posts about COVID-19, lockdowns, vaccines, the Hunter Biden laptop story, and the 2020 election result. So that's not just the Australian, which you might say, okay, that's a Murdoch outlet. I don't trust Murdoch as a source. Sure. This was the US Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. So what are the motivations of people who want to censor what other people read and say? Well, they often have an ulterior motive. In the case of the Stoics in ancient Rome, the accusers often had a personal grudge, as we've seen. Today, fact checkers often have lucrative contracts awarded for the specific purpose of censoring news. And of course, the ultimate motivation in both ancient Rome and today is about keeping power. It's a key motivating factor. People in power, of course, also would prefer to delegate the dirty work of censorship to third parties, such as the tech giants, so that the government can say, well, we're not doing it, it's the tech companies. So the only way of ensuring that history will be told is to permit a range of views to be expressed. And I'm afraid the COVID pandemic showed us that even in countries such as the Anglosphere, which have such a great tradition of freedom of speech and expression, peaceful protest has been criminalised and punished. And I'm afraid when the full story of these years is told, there will be much that will be uncomfortable to hear or read about all our countries. So what can or should we do? Well, we don't have to be a Thrasea-Paitis. Not everyone can be a Thrasea-Paitis, but we can be a Marcia or an Agricola. Marcia kept copies of her father's banned works and helped ensure their republication. Agricola was an honourable man under a dishonourable emperor, Domitian. We can tell the truth to power. We can keep the receipts. And by that I mean keep screenshots. You know, if you're told that, oh, well, as in Orwell's immortal words in 1984, we have always been at war with East Asia, you can keep the records that say, well, actually, no, we weren't at war with East Asia 2 years ago, or whatever it happens to be. Keep the receipts, keep the screenshots, and honour others who have paid a price to tell the truth. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Walled Garden podcast. In the Walled Garden Philosophical Society, we host regular events with world-class philosophers, theologians, poets, mystics, historians, and more on a broad range of topics. We also offer philosophical mentoring services for those who are in need of guidance on their own philosophical path. We'd love to see you around, so if you're interested in learning more, just go to thewalledgarden.com. But for now, we wish you well as you nurture the gardens of your mind.